The first time you hear it, it sounds harmless, a story told to children before bed, a moral dressed in folklore, a whisper about right and wrong. But when the same story appears in the margins of police reports, when fragments of its phrases echo in declassified memos, when men in suits repeat its proverbs as if they are passwords, then it stops being a bedtime tale. It becomes something else. The voices that carry these stories never claim authorship. They insist they are repeating, preserving, warning. Yet each retelling seems to move in lockstep with vanished names, missing files, and gaps in time. What we were told were parables now look more like instructions. What we dismissed as wisdom now feels like programming. And as the words repeat, as the same shapes emerge across decades, a question hardens in the silence. Who is really writing these stories, and what happens to those who finally understand them? It begins with a story so ordinary it slips beneath your guard. A parent leaning over a child's bed, the whisper of a tale designed to calm racing thoughts, the rhythm of words falling like a lullaby. We all know this shape, a warning wrapped in gentleness, a moral conclusion waiting at the end. But somewhere along the way, the edges blur. The tale begins to stretch beyond its boundaries. And the phrases, innocent, familiar, start to appear in places where they do not belong. A bedtime whisper becomes a line in a government memo. A proverb spoken by a grandmother surfaces inside a Cold War interrogation transcript. And suddenly the story is no longer safe. It begins to feel like a code. When archivists unearthed old FOIA documents, they did not expect to find the residue of folklore hidden between black bars of redaction. Yet there it was, a line, repeated word for word, identical to the wisdom tale spoken in villages thousands of miles away. At first it seemed like coincidence, but then it happened again. A different parable, preserved in oral tradition, turned up in an intelligence memo stamped eyes only. The phrase stood there like a ghost, haunting the page. Who placed it there? Why was it repeated? The question lingers like smoke. Village storytellers claimed the tales were older than memory, passed from one mouth to another, across centuries. Yet their cadences, their strange insistence on certain phrases, began to align with the voices of suspects recorded under interrogation lamps. Words spoken as confession. Words repeated as though compelled. The overlap between folklore and intelligence transcripts suggests something more than tradition. It suggests a pattern, one that is being curated, recycled, and embedded across generations. Even the corners of the internet, anonymous forums, obscure Reddit threads, carry traces of it. Users point out linguistic fingerprints that reappear across unrelated accounts of disappearances. The same proverb whispered by children in a playground is later found echoing in testimonies of people who claimed they saw something they should not have seen. A phrase dismissed as harmless begins to look like a thread tying vanishings together. The deeper you trace it, the more the story feels like a delivery system. Something designed not to entertain or enlighten, but to transmit. And then the paranoia takes root. What if every bedtime story we absorbed carried more than just morals? What if they carried instructions? Subtle, invisible commands buried beneath the narrative, waiting to be triggered. Parents told them with love, never knowing they were passing along something older, stranger, and perhaps dangerous. Children repeated them without suspicion, embedding the words deep into memory. Decades later, those words resurface in moments of crisis, like a sleeper program waking from a dream. Imagine the realization. The tale you thought was unique to your family, the parable you believed belonged to your childhood, was also recited in interrogation chambers, in secret meetings, in classified documents. Imagine understanding that your most innocent memories may have been engineered as vessels. That the bedtime ritual you cherished was not yours at all, but a transmission. Tonight, in the silence of your own thoughts, fragments of those stories rise again. They come unbidden, echoing in your mind, stitched into the quiet like a voice you never invited. You begin to wonder who first wrote them, who needed them to survive across time. And most unsettling of all, you begin to wonder if repeating them, even now, makes you part of their design. Because the truth hides in plain sight, stories survive because we carry them. We recite them. We pass them forward. If Whishdom stories are not stories but programs, then we are the messengers. We are the couriers. And by remembering them tonight, by letting them echo in your head, you have already fulfilled their purpose. The question sharpens into something you cannot escape. Whose voice have you really been carrying all along? And more importantly, what does it want from you now? Every record tells a story, but it's the missing pieces that speak the loudest. When you move through the archives, you begin to notice the absences, sharp cuts where memory should exist, moments that collapse into silence as if something has been deliberately severed. In the case of Whishdom stories, the blackouts are louder than the words preserved. Files vanish without explanation. Broadcasts bleed into static. Eyewitness accounts stop mid-sentence, voices swallowed before the truth can form. It does not feel like chance. It feels like choreography. Dispatcher logs from small towns record sudden 30-minute gaps, whole stretches of silence, always coinciding with mass story gatherings. Entire neighborhoods unaccounted for, as though time itself went missing. Police reports condense the chaos of multiple voices into a single sterile phrase. Could not identify. The testimony stripped away, reduced to a blank. The erasure is so consistent it feels intentional, a hand sweeping the page clean. Even the digital record is not immune. Archive.org captures reveal collections of folklore recordings, hundreds of files uploaded by independent researchers, deleted within days. No explanation. No trace in the metadata. Just absence, like a memory surgically removed. And those who try to repost them report strange glitches, audio corruption, playback errors, files refusing to render. As though the stories resist being archived. Then come the radio anomalies. Shortwave enthusiasts record sudden blackouts, bursts of static, long stretches of silence. When mapped, those silences align with specific motifs later heard in children's retellings of the tales. It is as if the stories themselves are encoded into the absence, like something slips through only when the signal cuts away. Silence as transmission. The more you stare into these gaps, the more the mind begins to betray itself. Because the longer you look, the more you feel that the erasure is not hiding the evidence at all. The erasure is the evidence. The silence is the voice. And maybe that voice has been speaking to you all along, in the spaces where the words should have been. If you sit with the stories long enough, if you let the silence stretch and resist the urge to look away, something begins to emerge. A second current beneath the surface. At first it feels like a trick of the ear, an echo, a bleed, some artifact of poor recording. But the deeper you listen, the more undeniable it becomes. The stories are not singular. They carry harmonics. A hidden voice layered beneath the one you're meant to hear. Amateur radio operators, the kind who obsessively log every anomaly, began to notice it first. They recorded broadcasts of traditional tales passed through community stations, and buried inside were overlapping whispers. Fragments of words spoken just beneath the storyteller's cadence. Not interference. Not static. A voice that should not be there. They slowed it down, looped it, dissected it. And what they heard was not random. It was structured. Digital spectrograms added another layer of unease. Analysts mapped the waveforms of recordings, only to find embedded shapes, phrases repeating at impossible intervals, a pulse that could not have been accidental. The words were not obvious, but they were present, threaded like veins through the sound. Commands, some said. Others swore they heard warnings. But the effect was always the same. Once heard, you couldn't unhear. Victims of what researchers call story events describe the same sensation, the feeling of being instructed mid-listening, of their thoughts no longer belonging entirely to themselves. One woman told investigators she felt her hands moving before she decided to move them. A man swore he remembered hearing a question in the middle of the tale, a question that no one else in the room could recall. The stories bend reality not only in what they say, but in what they slip beneath saying. Even the digital remnants are hunted. Posts on /r/nosleep detailing a voice that wasn't part of the story are repeatedly flagged, mass deleted, accounts shadow banned without explanation. Threads vanish mid-conversation, leaving behind only half replies, half thoughts. as though something inside the infrastructure itself is pruning any attempt to speak of the second voice. And the question grows louder with each fragment you uncover. What if the real story was never the one told out loud? What if the true message has always been hidden in the harmonics, the whisper just beneath the words, the voice you were never supposed to hear, but already have? The further back you trace the stories, the less they behave like folklore and the more they resemble an infection. Across continents, across decades, the same parables return, draped in new costumes, assigned to new cultures, but carrying identical phrasing, identical morals. Each resurfacing is framed as heritage, tradition, timeless wisdom. But once you see the pattern, it gnaws at you. At what point does ancient stop being ancient and start looking orchestrated? In remote Urdu villages, storytellers pass down moral tales with structures indistinguishable from those in Cold War training manuals. Word for word, the cadence of "do not stray from the road, for eyes are watching" echoes both in the desert and in declassified briefings. Modern children's books slip the same motifs between watercolor illustrations, hiding a lineage too precise to be dismissed as chance. The words leap across generations like a contagion refusing to burn out. Thematic overlaps deepen the paranoia. Rhetoric from UFO disclosure hearings, "You must listen, even if you don't understand," appears not as explanation but as mantra, echoing the very phrasing embedded in Whishdom stories. As though the voice of authority, whether human or not, has always carried the same instruction. Listen. Obey. Do not question. The message is recycled endlessly, in myth and in policy alike. Independent analysts, amateurs with too much time and too little sleep, create breakdowns in the style of Wendigoon, mapping conspiracy imagery across threads that should never touch. And yet the overlap is undeniable. The owl that warns, the road that deceives, the whisper that instructs. Each symbol reappears, too sharp to be coincidence, too consistent to be human error. Linguists, meanwhile, point to hidden authorship fingerprints buried in grammar choices. Patterns of syntax that defy cultural boundaries, resurfacing in languages that should not share DNA. It is as though a single invisible author is writing beneath the mask of humanity, leaving behind fingerprints that no one was meant to see. And then comes the guilt. The sudden realization that you too have repeated these phrases. That you whispered them to a sibling, or heard them from a teacher, or passed them along as harmless tradition. You thought you were remembering, but maybe you were transmitting. Maybe the infection only survives because we keep giving it breath. And by the time you recognize the pattern, it's already too late. You've spoken the words. You've kept them alive. By now, the ground beneath you feels unstable. The line between observer and participant has blurred, and the question no longer hovers at a distance. It presses in against your chest. If Whishdom stories are instructions disguised as morals, then every listener becomes a carrier. Every retelling, every whisper, every bedtime repetition is not memory but transmission. And the realization tightens like a fist. You have already spoken them aloud. Declassified fragments of Mkultra subprojects confirm what was once dismissed as paranoia. Hidden in the clutter of FOIA releases are experiments in embedding covert programming inside parables. Stories chosen not for their beauty, but for their stickiness. Researchers documented how the human mind clings to rhythm, rhyme, moral closure, perfect vehicles for mnemonic payloads. A tale can pass like smoke through generations, carrying the same command, dormant until the right trigger. Online, the pattern stalks those who try to expose it. Commenters who draw direct lines between folklore and black-budget research vanish from forums overnight. Entire threads collapse, usernames scrubbed clean, conversations amputated mid-sentence. The silence that follows feels less like censorship and more like subtraction, as though the participants themselves were absorbed into the story they were trying to resist. And so the emotional hook pulls tighter, not just as curiosity but as grief. Grief for those who followed a story too far and never returned. Grief for the children who repeated phrases that were never theirs. Paranoia settles in the marrow, the suspicion that you yourself are already a messenger, that the infection survives because it rides your voice, your memory, your unguarded retelling. Psychologists speculate that wisdom tales operate as mnemonic devices coded with hidden payloads, benign, harmless, even soothing until the exact trigger ignites them. A phrase, a symbol, a repeated cadence. And then the dormant instruction wakes, moving through the host like a spark through dry grass. What was once just a story becomes a command. And as the credits approach, the final provocation cannot be escaped. If every story is a program, then the transmission has already begun. The only question left to ask is the one that gnaws at you in the silence after the screen goes dark. What line have you already passed on tonight?